Gary, Alaska case. At 3:47 a.m. on January 12, 2004, a snowplow operator named Gary Linwood vanished into an Alaskan blizzard. His plow was found idling beside a frozen pond, engine running, door wide open, coffee still steaming on the dashboard. But Gary, gone. No footprints, no blood, no body, just gone. The police had their suspect within 48 hours, his wife, Linda. The evidence seemed damning. A fresh life insurance policy, financial troubles, her vehicle spotted near the scene. The jury took 6 hours to convict her of murder. The courtroom applauded when the verdict was read. Linda Linwood got 25 years for killing her husband. There was just one problem. 16 years later, they found Gary's body at the bottom of that frozen pond. And what the forensics revealed didn't just prove Linda was innocent. It exposed a conspiracy so twisted, so calculated, that it would bring an entire city to its knees. This is the true story of Gary Linwood, the man who discovered a secret someone was willing to kill for, the wife who lost everything, and the lies that stayed frozen until they finally thawed. What you're about to hear will make you question everything you think you know about justice. Because sometimes the coldest place in America isn't Alaska, it's a courtroom. Let me take you back to Anchorage, Alaska, January 2004, where a straightforward, no-nonsense snowplow driver named Gary Linwood was about to uncover something that would cost him his life. Hit subscribe if you believe everyone should be treated fairly. Only haters, manipulators, and trolls won't subscribe. If you believe people should be treated fairly, hit subscribe. Trolls won't. Comment, "I stand for justice," if you're not siding with the bully. At 42, Gary has the kind of face that tells you everything you need to know before he opens his mouth. Deep lines carved around his eyes from squinting through endless blizzards. A jaw that looks like it was chiseled from the same granite that forms the Chugach Mountains looming over the city. His hands, massive, calloused things, grip the steering wheel of his snowplow like they were born to do nothing else. And maybe they were. Someone's got to do it, Gary says, which is about as philosophical as he gets. It's his answer to why he works 16-hour shifts when the storms roll in from the Gulf of Alaska. It's his answer to why he's missed countless school plays, birthday parties, and anniversary dinners. It's his answer to everything. Really, delivered in that flat, matter-of-fact tone that doesn't invite argument or sympathy. Gary's been pushing snow in Anchorage for 19 years. Started when he was 23, fresh out of a brief and unsuccessful attempt at college in the lower 48. Alaska called him back. Or maybe he was running towards something, or away from something else. He doesn't talk about that. What he talks about, when he talks at all, is tonnage and blade angles and the specific density of snow at different temperatures. His wife, Linda, learned early on not to expect him home when the weather turns. She's a nurse at Providence, Alaska Medical Center, working her own brutal shifts, so they pass each other like ships charting different courses through the same dark waters. But there's something solid there, something that doesn't need constant tending. She knows he'll come home eventually, smelling like diesel and cold, and he knows she'll have left dinner in the fridge with instructions taped to the Tupperware. The kids, 2 boys, 14 and 11, have inherited their father's stocky build and their mother's patience. They've grown up understanding that Dad's absence during storms isn't abandonment. It's duty. The oldest, Marcus, sometimes rides along during smaller jobs, learning the routes and the rhythm of the work. Gary doesn't say much during these rides, but his hands on the controls speak volumes. This is legacy, passed through calloused palms and silent demonstration. Physically, Gary is exactly what you'd expect from someone who wrestles industrial machinery through Arctic conditions for a living. 5'10" but built like a fire plug, with shoulders that strain against his high-vis jacket and a gut that's more muscle than anything else, despite what Linda says about cutting back on the moose sausage. His movements are economical, efficient, no wasted motion, no unnecessary flourish. When he walks, it's with the slight bow-legged gait of someone whose knees have absorbed too many jolts from potholes hidden under 3 feet of powder. But it's Gary's straightforwardness that defines him more than any physical characteristic. Ask him a question, get an answer. No sugarcoating, no dancing around feelings. When the new guy asked if the job gets easier, Gary said, "Nope," and left it at that. When his youngest asked if Dad was scared during the big storm that knocked out power to half the city, Gary said, "Yep," then went back to his dinner. This isn't rudeness, it's just Gary being Gary. He sees the world in stark contrasts: roads cleared or roads blocked, equipment working or equipment broken, job done or job not done. His character is forged from the same elements as the work itself: relentless, unyielding, essential. He's the kind of man who shows up every time. When other operators call in sick, or when the storm is so bad that even the weather service is telling people to shelter in place, Gary's already fired up his plow, checking hydraulics and fluid levels with practiced precision. The truth is, Anchorage runs on people like Gary Linwood. While politicians debate and planners plan, while influencers post and entrepreneurs hustle, Gary is out there at 3 a.m., making sure the emergency vehicles can reach the hospital, making sure people can get to work, making sure life continues despite nature's best efforts to bring everything to a frozen standstill. He doesn't think of himself as a hero. Heroes, in Gary's estimation, are people who do extraordinary things. He's just doing his job. But ask anyone who's ever been stuck in their driveway during a blizzard, who's seen that massive orange plow emerge from the whiteout like a mechanical savior, and they'll tell you different. January 12th, 2004, 3:47 a.m. Dispatch lost contact with Gary Linwood somewhere along his northern route. Not unusual, radios cut out all the time in whiteout conditions. But when dawn broke gray and bitter over the city, and Gary still hadn't checked in, someone was sent to find him. They found the plow first. Unit 23 sat idling beside Reflection Pond, its massive blade still angled left, yellow hazards cutting through the dying storm like a heartbeat. The driver's door hung open, engine running, heater blasting, and on the dashboard, steam still rising from Gary's thermos. The same dented steel one he'd carried for 15 years, the one Linda had bought him their first Christmas together. But Gary, gone. Officer Mike Reeves was first on scene. 23 years on the force, seen everything Alaska could throw at a man. But this made his gut twist. He circled the plow twice, expecting to find Gary relieving himself behind a snowbank or checking the blade for damage. Nothing. He called out, voice swallowed by wind. Nothing. Then he noticed what wasn't there. No footprints. Not a single goddamn footprint leading away from the plow. Just fresh powder, smooth as a bedsheet, stretching in every direction. Only the faint trace of tire marks remained visible, already half buried, pointing toward the access road that wrapped around the pond. By noon, the place looked like a crime scene from a movie. Yellow tape, police cruisers, detectives stomping through snow that kept falling, kept erasing, kept hiding whatever truth might be buried underneath. They brought in cadaver dogs who went crazy at the pond's edge, then lost the scent. Divers couldn't break through ice that had formed 3 feet thick over a winter that wouldn't quit. The theories started before the police tape even came down. At Tommy's Diner on Northern Lights Boulevard, where Gary ate breakfast every Sunday, the speculation ran hot as the coffee. Old Frank Tomlinson, who'd known Gary since he was a kid, swore Gary must have fallen through thin ice. Man works alone at night. One wrong step, that's all it takes. But Sarah Chen, who managed the place, shook her head. Ice was solid, has been for weeks, and Gary knew every inch of these roads. Then the darker whispers began. Gary owed money, that's what some said. Gambling debts to someone who didn't appreciate late payments. He'd run off to Seattle or Vancouver, started over somewhere warm where snow couldn't find him. Others said no, it was simpler than that. Linda, the marriage. Everyone knew they barely saw each other, ships passing in the night. Maybe Gary had finally had enough. Maybe he'd walked away from everything, the job, the kids, the whole frozen life he'd built. But none of it explained the thermos. Still hot, still steaming. Detective Rachel Donnelly caught the case, and she didn't like any of it. 28 years old, hungry to prove herself in a department that still called her the girl from Juneau. She went through Gary's life like a blizzard through a ghost town. Fast, thorough, leaving nothing untouched. The logbook made her stop cold. Gary was methodical, obsessive even. Every route documented. Times, conditions, equipment checks. The man recorded everything. But January 12th? The entries didn't make sense. Gary had completed his scheduled routes. Northern Lights Boulevard, Benson, the airport access roads. Standard night shift work. Then there were 2 more entries. 2 routes he wasn't assigned. 2 routes that took him to the industrial area near the docks and out to the edge of Eagle River, miles from where he should have been. Times logged. Conditions noted. Everything in Gary's careful, blocky handwriting. Why would Gary go off-route? Why work areas he wasn't being paid for? And why, at the end of that logbook, was there a single word scrawled in the margin, underlined 3 times? Proof. Donnelly was still chewing on that when her phone rang. Anonymous tip, male voice, muffled, probably calling from a payphone. Dispatch played her the recording. You're looking in the wrong place. Check Linda Linwood. Check where she was that night. Her SUV was at Reflection Pond. Same time her husband disappeared. The investigation pivoted like a plow blade hitting concrete. Linda Linwood had always been invisible in the best way possible. She worked night shifts at Providence, Alaska Medical Center, patching up frostbite victims and heart attack patients with the same steady hands she used to pack school lunches and sign permission slips. She kept the house running while Gary kept the roads clear. She was the kind of woman people passed in the grocery store without really seeing, until the day her face was plastered across every newspaper in Alaska. Snowplow widow. Did she do it? The investigation moved with the speed and subtlety of an avalanche. Detective Donnelly pulled Gary's financial records, and there it was. A life insurance policy. New, filed December 8th, 2003. Just 35 days before Gary vanished into that white nightmare. $500,000. Beneficiary, Linda Marie Linwood. That's a lot of money for a snowplow operator to carry, Donnelly said, sliding the papers across the conference table where 3 other detectives sat. Coffee cooling in styrofoam cups. Maybe he was being responsible, offered Detective Morris, the oldest in the room. The one who still wanted to believe in simple explanations. Or maybe someone was planning ahead. Donnelly countered. They started digging deeper, talking to everyone who'd ever exchanged more than 2 words with Gary Linwood. And that's when Tommy Martinez came forward. Tommy worked the same depot as Gary, drove a plow on the South Side routes. Decent guy, quiet. The kind who showed up to work, did his job, went home. He sat in the interview room, fidgeting with his wedding ring, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. I didn't think much of it at the time, Tommy said, not meeting Donnelly's eyes. But yeah, I heard them. Gary and Linda. It was maybe Tuesday? Wednesday? Week before he disappeared. Heard them where? Gary was on his cell in the break room. Door was cracked. I was getting coffee. Tommy paused. They were arguing about money. Linda wanted something, I don't know what. Gary kept saying they couldn't afford it, that she needed to be realistic. It got pretty heated. What exactly did you hear Gary say? Tommy swallowed. He said, I'm not a damn ATM, Linda. Figure it out yourself. The detective leaned forward. And what did you do? Nothing. I walked away. Wasn't my business. Tommy looked up then, something defensive in his eyes. Look, marriages go through rough patches. Doesn't mean anything. But it meant everything now. The story spread through Anchorage like oil on ice. Fast, dark, impossible to contain. The local news picked it up first. Then the Anchorage Daily News ran it front page. Missing snowplow driver had recent life insurance policy. Wife questioned. By day 3, Linda couldn't leave her house without cameras in her face. Someone spray-painted murderer on her garage door. At Providence, they asked her to take a temporary leave of absence while the investigation continued. The boys, Marcus and 11-year-old Ethan, stopped going to school after classmates started whispering. Linda sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Gary used to eat his moose sausage, and watched her life disintegrate in real time. Then the forensics report came back. Fiber evidence. Found in Gary's plow cab, snagged on the passenger seat adjustment lever. Synthetic material, navy blue with a specific weave pattern. The lab tech's voice crackled through Donnelly's phone with barely contained excitement. It's a match. The fibers are consistent with the coat Linda Linwood was wearing when we interviewed her. Donnelly hung up and stared at the evidence board in the precinct. Photos of Gary, the idling plow, the frozen pond, and now, in red marker, a new connection. Linda's coat, plow cab. That places her at the scene, Morris said, standing behind her. That places her in the plow, at some point. Donnelly tapped the photo of the open door. But when? Does it matter? We've got motive, insurance money. We've got opportunity. She was out that night, lied about it. We've got physical evidence. The DA's going to want to move on this. Donnelly knew he was right, knew what came next. But something still didn't sit right. Gary's logbook, those extra roots, that word, proof. Proof of what? The arrest happened on January 24th, 2004. 12 days after Gary vanished. They came at dawn, always when the world is cold and half awake and nothing seems quite real. Linda was still in her bathrobe when they read her rights. The boys watched from the top of the stairs, frozen, as their mother was led out in handcuffs. The mugshot became iconic. Linda Linwood, hair pulled back, face empty of everything except exhaustion. Dark circles under her eyes, jaw set, not crying, not pleading, just hollowed out. The Anchorage Daily News ran it above the fold. Snowplow widow arrested in husband's disappearance. The public ate it up. Online forums exploded with amateur detectives. Everyone had a theory. Everyone knew what really happened. Cold-blooded wife kills devoted father for insurance money. Tale as old as time. Case closed. Except the lab called back on January 28th. Dr. Sarah Yoon from the State Crime Lab, voice tight and professional. In that way, that means someone's about to get fired. Detective Donnelly, we need to discuss the fiber evidence from the Linwood case. Donnelly felt her stomach drop. What about it? There was a mislabeling issue? The fibers we matched to Mrs. Linwood's coat? A pause. They weren't from the plow cab. They were from a completely different case. Domestic burglary in Fairbanks. The evidence bags got switched during processing. You're telling me the fiber evidence is worthless? I'm telling you it doesn't exist. The fibers from the plow cab don't match Linda Linwood's coat. They don't match anything in our database. We have no idea where they came from. Donnelly closed her eyes. How soon can you issue a correction? We're preparing the documentation now. But detective? Yoon's voice dropped. This is bad. This is really bad. She's already been charged. The correction was issued. The lab admitted the error. A small article ran on page 7 of the Daily News. Evidence error in Linwood case. Nobody read it. Nobody cared. The narrative was set. Linda Linwood was the snowplow widow, the woman who killed her husband for money and nearly got away with it. Her bail was set at $250,000, money she didn't have, money she'd never have. She sat in a cell at Highland Mountain Correctional Center and waited for a trial she couldn't afford to fight. And somewhere out there, under the snow and the ice and all the lies, the truth about what happened to Gary Linwood remained buried. But not forever. Never forever. Linda Linwood, 41. Nurse, mother of 2, wife of the missing man. Suddenly, she was sitting across from Donnelly in an interview room that smelled like burnt coffee and desperation, her hands folded on the table, her face carved from stone. "Where were you the night of January 12th, Mrs. Linwood?" "Home, asleep. I worked a double shift the day before." "Anyone verify that?" "My boys were home. They were asleep too." "What about your vehicle? Your 2001 Ford Explorer? Where was it?" Something flickered behind Linda's eyes, just for a second. "In the driveway. Where else would it be?" Donnelly slid a photo across the table. Security footage from a gas station, grainy and time-stamped, 3:12 a.m., January 12th. A Ford Explorer matching Linda's description, heading north, toward Reflection Pond. "Want to try again, Mrs. Linwood?" Linda's jaw tightened. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, empty. "I want a lawyer." The city exploded with speculation. The loyal wife was a killer. The straightforward snowplow operator had secrets. And somewhere under all that snow, under all those lies, was a truth that someone desperately wanted to stay buried. But Reflection Pond wasn't done giving up its secrets. Not by a long shot. The trial began on a Monday in October, 9 months after Gary disappeared into the white. Anchorage Superior Court, Judge Patricia Hendricks presiding. The gallery was packed, standing room only, people lined up outside hoping for a seat, like it was a concert instead of a woman's life being dissected under fluorescent lights. Linda sat at the defense table in a borrowed Navy suit. Her public defender beside her shuffling papers with hands that shook just enough to notice. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Webb was a shark in a cheap tie. 38, with political ambitions that required a conviction rate high enough to look good on campaign posters. He stood before the jury. 7 women, 5 men, faces already hardened by 9 months of headlines, and painted his picture with broad, damning strokes. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a story about greed. About a woman who looked at her husband and saw not a partner, not the father of her children, but a paycheck. $500,000. Webb let that number hang in the air. Gary Linwood worked brutal hours in brutal conditions to provide for his family. And how did Linda Linwood repay that devotion? She planned his murder. She executed it on a night when no one would see, when the storm would cover her tracks. And then she lied, repeatedly, about where she was, about what she knew. The fiber evidence, the mislabeled, worthless, completely irrelevant fiber evidence, was mentioned exactly once in Webb's opening statement. A footnote. Now, the defense will make much of a lab error involving some fibers. But let me be clear. That error doesn't erase the mountain of other evidence. The life insurance, the financial arguments, Linda's vehicle at the scene, her lies to police. One mistake in a lab doesn't make a guilty woman innocent. The jury nodded. They'd already decided. The trial was just a formality. Linda's attorney, David Chen, was fresh out of law school and drowning. He stood, cleared his throat, and tried to build a lifeboat out of reasonable doubt. My client is innocent. The prosecution's case is built on circumstantial evidence and a rush to judgment. Gary Linwood was a good man caught in a bad situation. He discovered something. Something that made him keep that logbook. Something that made him write the word proof. Gary wasn't running from his wife. He was running toward the truth. And someone made sure he never got there. It sounded thin even to Linda's own ears. The prosecution called witness after witness, each one hammering another nail into Linda's coffin. Tommy Martinez repeated his story about the argument. Under Webb's gentle questioning, the fight sounded worse, angrier, more desperate. She wanted money for something. Gary said no, she got mad, real mad. Financial experts testified about the Linwoods' credit card debt. $19,000. Medical bills from when Ethan broke his arm. The mortgage. 2 car payments. They were drowning. One expert said, charts and graphs glowing on a projector screen. That insurance policy would have solved everything. But the testimony that killed Linda came from Gary's best friend. Tom Kincaid, 44, had known Gary since high school. They'd fished together, hunted together, gotten drunk together on more occasions than either could count. Tom walked to the witness stand like a man heading to a funeral, which, in a way, he was. "Tom," Webb said gently, "you and Gary were close, weren't you?" "Brothers. We were like brothers." "When was the last time you spoke with him?" Tom's jaw worked. "January 10th, 2 days before He couldn't finish. "What did you talk about?" "His marriage. Linda." Gary said. Tom looked at Linda for the first time. She stared back, unblinking. He said he was going to leave her, that he'd had enough. He was planning to tell her that week, file for separation. He wanted the boys, but he couldn't live like that anymore. The courtroom erupted. Judge Hendricks banged her gavel, but the damage was done. Linda's face crumpled, just for a second, before she rebuilt that stone mask. "Are you certain that's what he said?" Webb pressed, word for word. "I can't do this anymore, Tom. I'm out." Chen's cross-examination was desperate, flailing. "Isn't it true that Gary never mentioned divorce in any of his writings? His logbook? His personal effects?" "Gary wasn't a writer. He talked to me." "Isn't it possible you're misremembering?" "I remember perfectly. My best friend told me he was leaving his wife. 2 days later, he disappeared. You do the math." When the defense's turn came, Chen tried to introduce what Gary had actually been investigating. Called a former city worker who claimed there were irregularities in the Public Works Department. Kickbacks, falsified overtime, contractors billing for routes never plowed. Gary had noticed. Gary had been documenting. "That's what the extra routes were about," Chen argued. Gary was gathering evidence of corruption. Someone found out. Someone silenced him. Webb objected. "Speculation? Conspiracy theory? Where's the proof?" Gary wrote proof in his logbook. One word, that could mean anything. Could mean he was trying to prove his wife was cheating. Could mean he needed proof for a divorce. The defense is asking this jury to believe in some elaborate municipal conspiracy rather than the obvious truth. A wife killed her husband for money. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the forewoman wouldn't look at Linda. That's how you know. That's always how you know. On the charge of murder in the 2nd degree, how do you find? Guilty. The courtroom exploded into applause. Actual applause, like Linda's conviction was a sports victory, like justice had been served with a neat bow. Judge Hendricks didn't even try to stop it. She banged her gavel half-heartedly, but her face said she agreed with the verdict. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. 25 years in Highland Mountain Correctional Center. Marcus would be 39 when his mother got out. Ethan would be 36 if she lived that long. If she survived it. Linda stood when the sentence was read. Didn't cry. Didn't scream. Just stood there, hollow, while the gavel fell and her life ended. "Justice for Gary?" someone shouted from the gallery. But in the back row, nearly hidden behind a pillar, sat Hank Morrison, 67 years old, retired city worker, Gary's old backup driver from when Hank still worked the roads. He'd driven plow for 34 years before his knees gave out and the city gave him a pension. Hank had been in that courtroom every day of the trial, sitting, watching, saying nothing. And when that gavel dropped, when the courtroom erupted in celebration, Hank's face went white as January snow. His hands gripped the bench in front of him, knuckles bloodless. His mouth opened, then closed. Opened again. He stood abruptly, stumbling past the people beside him, pushing toward the exit with something like panic in his eyes. An old woman next to him asked if he was all right. Hank didn't answer, just kept moving, kept pushing, kept running from something no one else could see. Outside, in the October cold that was nothing compared to what was coming, Hank Morrison leaned against the courthouse wall and threw up into a trash can. When he could breathe again, when the shaking stopped enough to function, he pulled out his cell phone. His finger hovered over 911. Then he thought about his pension, his grandkids, his wife's medical bills. He put the phone away, got in his truck, drove home, and said nothing. Not yet. Not yet. But the truth, like spring in Alaska, was coming eventually. And when it arrived, it would melt everything. A podcast about justice left in the cold episode 1. The Man Who Disappeared in White. Published March 15th, 2012. Eli Cormack was 26 years old and tired of covering city council meetings for the Anchorage Press. He wanted a story that mattered. Something real. Something that would make people stop scrolling and actually listen. He found it in a dusty archive box labeled Linwood G. 2004. My name is Eli Cormack, and I think Alaska sent an innocent woman to prison. That's how the first episode opened. Eli's voice, young and earnest, over the sound of wind howling through empty streets. Within a week, Frozen Truth had 50,000 downloads. Within a month, it was trending on iTunes. People who'd never heard of Gary Linwood or his widow were suddenly experts, debating evidence in comment sections and Facebook groups. But Eli wasn't interested in internet sleuths. He was interested in the truth. He started where the original investigation should have but didn't, with the money. Gary's personnel file from the municipality of Anchorage Public Works Department sat in a warehouse in South Anchorage. Boxed up with thousands of other records no one would ever look at again. Eli spent 3 days going through it, page by page, filing through overtime logs and maintenance reports until his eyes burned. That's when he found them. The discrepancies. Gary's overtime hours, logged and approved, didn't match the routes documented in his personal logbook, the same logbook that had mysteriously disappeared from evidence storage sometime in 2006. But Eli had obtained copies of some pages through a FOIA request. The dates didn't align. January 3rd, 2004. Official log showed Gary worked 14 hours overtime, clearing the airport access roads. His personal logbook, 8 hours, standard shift. December 28th, 2003. Official log claimed 16 hours overtime on emergency storm routes. Gary's notes, 12 hours, light snow, home by midnight. November 19th, 2003. Official log, 18 hours overtime. Gary's logbook, 10 hours. Quiet night, equipment check only. Someone was padding the overtime. Someone was billing the city for hours never worked. And every single fraudulent timesheet had the same signature at the bottom, approving the overtime, authorizing the payment. Thomas J. Kincaid, shift supervisor Gary's best friend. The man who testified that Gary was planning to leave Linda. The man who'd stood in that courtroom and looked Linda in the eye while he destroyed her life. Frozen Truth, Episode 3. The Supervisor's Signature. Published March 29th, 2012. Eli sat across from Margaret Yates in her small apartment in Eagle River. She was 62, worked in the Public Works Accounting Department from 1998 to 2006. Retired early for reasons she didn't want to discuss. Until now. I knew something was wrong, Margaret said, hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. The overtime numbers were insane. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars over budget. But when I flagged it for review, I was told to mind my business, that the supervisors had it handled. Who told you that? Tom Kincaid. He came to my office personally. Said the drivers were working their asses off and deserved every penny. Made me feel like I was the bad guy for questioning it. She paused. But then Gary Linwood came to see me. Eli leaned forward. When? Early January 2004, maybe the 7th or 8th. He had his logbook with him, showed me his actual hours versus what was being submitted. He was furious. Not at me, at what was happening. He said someone was stealing from the city and using the drivers' names to do it. What did you tell him? I told him to go to Internal Affairs, to document everything and make it official. Margaret's eyes filled. He said he would. Said he had proof. 3 days later, he was gone. Eli found 4 other former employees willing to talk. All of them remembered Gary. All of them knew something was wrong with the overtime system. And all of them had been told by Tom Kincaid or by Assistant Director Ron Welker to keep quiet or find work elsewhere. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Supervisors like Kincaid would submit inflated overtime hours for their drivers. The city would cut checks. The drivers, working long hours in brutal conditions, exhausted and focused on just getting through their shifts, rarely checked their pay stubs carefully enough to notice they weren't actually receiving all the overtime being billed in their names. The difference went somewhere else. Kickbacks, under-the-table payments, bonuses that never appeared on any official paperwork. Gary had figured it out. Gary, who documented everything, who noticed every discrepancy, who couldn't let things go. Gary had confronted Tom. Frozen Truth, Episode 5. The Confrontation. Published April 12, 2012. Eli tracked down Dale Pritchard, another plow driver who'd worked the same depot as Gary and Tom. Dale had moved to Oregon in 2005. Got out of Alaska entirely after what happened. He agreed to talk on the condition that Eli not reveal his current location. I was there, Dale said over a phone connection that crackled with distance. January 8, 2004. Break room at the depot. Gary had his logbook and a stack of pay stubs. He laid them out in front of Tom and said, "Explain this." What did Tom say? At first, tried to laugh it off. Said there must be some clerical error. But Gary wasn't having it. He said, "I know what you're doing, Tom. I know about the kickbacks. I know about Welker. And I'm going to Internal Affairs tomorrow." How did Tom react? Dale went quiet for a long moment. Tom's face went cold. I'd never seen him like that. He said, "Gary, you don't understand what you're messing with. There are people involved who don't play games." Gary just grabbed his stuff and left. That was the last time I saw him. 4 days later, he was gone. Did you tell the police this? I tried. After Gary disappeared, I went to the precinct. Told them about the overtime fraud, about the confrontation. They took my statement and said they'd look into it. Never heard back. Then when Linda got arrested, I figured they knew better than me. Did you testify at the trial? No one asked me to. Eli's hands were shaking when he hung up the phone. The pieces were falling into place. Gary wasn't killed by his wife for insurance money. Gary was killed, or disappeared, or silenced, because he'd uncovered corruption. Because he was about to blow the whistle on a scheme that probably involved not just Tom Kincaid, but people higher up the food chain. But Eli needed more. He needed the smoking gun. He found it in the phone records. Frozen Truth, Episode 7. The Anonymous Tip. Published April 26, 2012. The anonymous call that had pivoted the entire investigation toward Linda, the call claiming her SUV was at Reflection Pond, had been logged by dispatch at 2:47 p.m. on January 14, 2004. Male voice. Refused to give a name. Hung up immediately after delivering the tip. The original investigation had noted it came from a payphone. Case closed. Could have been anyone. Except Eli got the actual phone records through a second FOIA request, one that took 3 months and a lawyer's letter to pry loose. He sat in his apartment at 2 a.m., staring at the document, reading the same line over and over. The call hadn't come from a payphone. Eli cross-referenced the number with every database he could access. Municipal directories, old phone books, reverse lookup services. Finally, buried in a 2004 city employee directory, he found it. Municipality of Anchorage, Public Works Department, Administrative Office. The call that destroyed Linda Linwood's life, that sent her to prison for a murder she didn't commit, had come from inside the same department where the fraud was happening. Where Tom Kincaid worked, where Ron Welker had an office. Someone with access to that phone had framed Linda, had pointed the investigation away from the real reason Gary Linwood disappeared. Eli published the finding in Episode 7. Within hours, it went viral. Free Linda Linwood started trending. News outlets that had ignored the podcast suddenly wanted interviews. The Innocence Project reached out, and in her cell at Highland Mountain, Linda Linwood, now 49 years old, gray streaking through her dark hair, 8 years older and infinitely harder, heard about Eli Cormack's podcast from another inmate. For the first time since 2004, Linda Linwood allowed herself to hope. But in a house in South Anchorage, Tom Kincaid listened to Episode 7 with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. And when it ended, he poured himself a drink, then another, then a third. His phone rang. Unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. The message was brief. A voice he recognized. "We need to talk. Now." Tom deleted the voicemail, poured another drink, and wondered if 8 years had been long enough. It hadn't. The backhoe hit something solid on March 3, 2020. Reflection Pond was being drained for a city expansion project, new drainage systems, environmental impact studies, the bureaucratic machinery of urban development grinding forward. The crew had been at it for 2 weeks when the bucket scraped across something that wasn't silt or rock or the usual debris of a forgotten pond. The operator stopped. Called his supervisor. The supervisor called the city. The city called the police. By noon, Detective Sarah Chen, no relation to Linda's long-ago public defender, stood at the pond's edge watching divers descend into murky water that hadn't seen sunlight in 16 years. The pond was half-drained, exposing a moonscape of mud and preserved garbage. Shopping carts, tires, the skeleton of a bicycle, and a body. Gary Linwood emerged from the ice like a time traveler. Preserved by cold water and silt that had wrapped him in a cocoon for nearly 2 decades, his parka, bright orange with the Municipal Public Works logo still visible on the chest, clung to him like a second skin. His face, bloated and pale, was recognizable from the photos Chen had studied when Eli Cormack's podcast had reopened questions the department would rather have stayed buried. The medical examiner's report landed on Chen's desk 4 days later. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull. Massive fracture at the base of the cranium, consistent with being struck from behind with a heavy object. Secondary injuries to the cervical spine. Gary Linwood had been dead before he hit the water, if he'd even hit the water at all. Someone had dumped him there. Not drowning, not an accident. Murder. Chen flipped to the inventory of personal effects recovered with the body. Wallet, present. Wedding ring, present. Watch, present. Stopped at 4:17 a.m. ID badge clipped to his parka pocket, present. Gary's face smiling out from laminated plastic like he was still alive. Still out there somewhere, pushing snow through endless nights. But his key ring, the one Gary carried religiously, the one with keys to his house, his truck, and his plow, was missing. Chen stared at that absence like it was a neon sign. The forensics team had scraped Gary's fingernails, and what they found made Chen's blood run cold. Paint fragments, industrial orange. Chemical analysis matched it to the specific paint formula used on Municipality of Anchorage snowplows, standard issue from 2001 to 2008. But not from Gary's plow. The paint under his nails had trace elements, a slightly different primer composition, that matched plows manufactured in 1999 and 2000. Gary's plow, Unit 23, had been manufactured in 2002. Chen pulled the equipment records, hands moving faster now, that electric feeling of a case breaking open singing through her nerves. Unit 23 had been reassigned after Gary's disappearance. Standard procedure. Can't let equipment sit idle during a brutal winter. Reassigned on January 20th, 2004. Reassigned to Thomas J. Kincaid, shift supervisor. But Tom had been driving a different plow before that. Chen pulled the records. Tom's previous assignment, Unit 17, manufactured 1999. Same paint formula found under Gary's fingernails. Chen sat back in her chair and let the pieces fall into place. Gary had been killed in or near Tom's plow. Had grabbed at something, scratched at something, left paint under his nails like a message in a bottle. Then his body had been dumped in Reflection Pond, where it should have stayed buried forever under ice and silt and 16 years of forgetting. The keys were missing because whoever killed Gary had needed them. Needed to move Gary's plow, stage the scene, make it look like Gary had simply vanished mid-shift. Needed to erase any evidence that Gary had been anywhere near Tom Kincaid that night. Chen picked up her phone and dialed the prosecutor's office. "We need to talk about the Linwood case," she said. "And we need to talk about getting Linda Linwood out of prison. Now." Across town, in a modest house that had gotten smaller over the years, Tom Kincaid saw the news alert on his phone. Body found in Reflection Pond, identified as Gary Linwood. His hands started shaking and didn't stop. Detective Sarah Chen found Tom Kincaid in a dive bar on Spennard Road at 2 in the afternoon. He looked like a man who'd been drowning for years and finally stopped fighting. 60 years old, but looked 75. Hands trembling around a rocks glass that was mostly ice and regret. The bartender knew him by name, never a good sign. Tom Kincaid? Chen slid onto the stool beside him. Tom didn't look up. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." "I'm not selling. I'm collecting." Chen placed a photo on the bar, Gary Linwood's body still in that orange parka, mud-covered and impossibly preserved. 16 years, that's how long he was down there. Tom's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully, like it might explode. Jesus. You testified at Linda Linwood's trial. Said Gary was planning to leave her? Said they were having marital problems? That's what I said. Was it true? Tom finally looked at her. His eyes were road maps of burst blood vessels and sleepless nights. Does it matter now? It matters to the woman who's been in prison for 8 years for a murder she didn't commit. Tom picked up his glass, drained it, signaled for another. I got nothing to say without a lawyer. Chen smiled without warmth. Then get one, because we're just getting started. The forensic team tore apart Unit 17, Tom's old plow, long since retired and sitting in a municipal equipment graveyard. 16 years of rust and neglect, but technology had gotten better. Luminol revealed blood spatter in the cab. Microscopic but unmistakable. The interior door handle yielded a partial palm print preserved in ancient grease and grime. The automated fingerprint identification system, upgraded since 2004, more sensitive, more comprehensive, ran the print through every database available. It took 18 minutes. Chen pulled Hal's file, Gary's old backup driver, the man who'd sat in that courtroom in 2004 watching Linda's conviction, looking shaken. The man who'd nearly called 911 and then decided his pension mattered more than the truth. Now 64, living in a small house in Mountain View, collecting that pension and living with what he'd done. Chen knocked on his door on a Tuesday morning. Hal opened it, already crying. I knew you'd come eventually, he said. The interview room at the Anchorage Police Department smelled like disinfectant and fear. Hal sat across from Chen and Ada Marcus Webb. Older now, grayer, but still hungry for the cameras, still positioning himself for the optics of whatever came next. Tell us what happened, Hal. Hal's hands twisted together on the table. Tom called me. January 11th, late. Said Gary was causing problems. Said he was going to blow the whistle on the overtime thing, that we'd all lose our jobs, maybe go to prison. Tom said we needed to talk to Gary, convince him to back off. And did you? We followed him that night. Gary's route took him out by Reflection Pond around 3 a.m. Tom flagged him down, made it look like a supervisor check. Gary pulled over. Hal's voice cracked. Tom told me to get in the plow with Gary, talk to him. I was supposed to scare him, just scare him. What happened? Gary was furious. Said he was going to internal affairs the next day, that he didn't care what happened to us. We argued. It got heated. Gary tried to push me out of the cab. I shoved back. He slipped. Hal's face crumpled. His head hit the door frame, the metal edge. I heard it crack. He just stopped moving. Chen leaned forward. Then what? I panicked. Called Tom. He came with one of the city loaders from the maintenance yard. We used it to break through the thin ice at the pond's edge. Pushed Gary under. Tom said the storm would cover everything. Said no one would know. Hal looked up, tears streaming. I never meant to kill him. I swear to God. It was an accident. And the anonymous call about Linda's SUV. Tom made me do it. Said we needed to point them somewhere else, away from us. From the Public Works office phone. Tom had access. He made the call. I was just... Hal buried his face in his hands. I'm just a coward. Chen turned off the recorder. You know what happens now. I know. I'm ready. But Tom Kincaid wasn't. Brought in for questioning, sober for the first time in years because his lawyer demanded it. Tom sat in that same interview room and called Hal a liar. He's obsessed with Gary. Always was. Jealous of him. Gary was a better driver, better man. Hal couldn't handle it. Tom's voice was steady, practiced. I wasn't even working that night. Check the schedules. I was home. Chen slid the schedule across the table. You weren't on the official schedule, but 3 drivers remember seeing you at the depot. Remember you leaving around 2:30 a.m.? They're mistaken. Your palm print is in that plow. I rode in every plow at some point. I was a supervisor. That's my job. What about the phone call? What phone call? You mean the anonymous tip? Could have been anyone with access to that office. Could have been Hal. Could have been a dozen people. Tom's lawyer, expensive, sharp, hired with money Tom shouldn't have had, leaned forward. Unless you can definitively prove my client was at that pond, unless you have physical evidence placing him at the scene of the crime, this is all speculation. Hal Bixby is a desperate man trying to reduce his sentence by implicating others. It won't work. And the horrifying truth was, he was right. Hal's confession implicated Tom, but it was still just one man's word against another's. The palm print in the plow was circumstantial. Tom had legitimate reasons to have been in that vehicle at some point. The witnesses who remembered seeing Tom that night, their memories were 16 years old, fuzzy, easily challenged. The overtime fraud investigation had been quietly buried in 2006, when the city settled several civil suits and reorganized the Public Works Department. Records had been destroyed per retention policies. Ron Welker, the assistant director, had died of a heart attack in 2009. The paper trail was ashes. Without hard evidence, without something concrete tying Tom to Gary's murder, prosecutors couldn't definitively overturn Linda's conviction. Hal's confession only proved that Gary was murdered and his body was dumped. It didn't legally exonerate Linda, not yet, not without more. The city's position, delivered through carefully worded press releases, was that they were reviewing all available evidence and committed to justice. What they were actually doing was scrambling to contain decades of corruption, terrified of the lawsuits, the federal investigations, the careers that would implode if everything came to light. Linda Linwood remained in prison. 8 years became 9. The appeals process ground forward with the speed of glacial ice. And Tom Kincaid walked free. Back to that bar on Spennard Road, back to that glass of whiskey, living with what he'd done and what he'd never admit. Justice, it turned out, could be as cold and unforgiving as an Anchorage winter. But somewhere in that evidence room, in boxes being reviewed for the 4th time, was something everyone had missed. Something that would change everything. It just hadn't been found yet. Eli Cormack's voice had matured over the years, lost some of that youthful earnestness, and gained something harder, more determined. This is the story of how a city chose corruption over truth. How good men stayed silent. How an innocent woman lost 18 years of her life. And how, eventually, the ice gave way. Season 2 of Frozen Truth dropped like a bomb on Anchorage. 10 episodes, each one meticulously researched, each one another nail in the coffin. Eli had spent 2 years following every thread, interviewing everyone who'd ever touched the case. The podcast reached #1 on iTunes. Then CNN called. Then the New York Times. Then the governor's office. Public outrage became a tsunami. Justice for Linda trended for 3 straight weeks. Protesters gathered outside the Anchorage Police Department, outside City Hall, outside Highland Mountain Correctional, where Linda had spent 18 years of her life for a murder she didn't commit. The FBI opened an investigation into municipal corruption. The new mayor, young, ambitious, untainted by 2004, ordered a complete reinvestigation, and the state brought in digital forensics experts from Seattle to examine something everyone had assumed was gone forever: the city's old payroll system backups. They found them on degraded tape drives in a storage facility in Palmer. Data recovery took 3 months. But when those files finally opened, they revealed everything: deleted payroll records, fraudulent overtime signatures. Tom Kincaid and Hal Bixby had both clocked emergency overtime the night of January 12th, 2004. Hours that never appeared on official schedules, buried in the system's deleted files, but preserved on backup tapes no one remembered existed. The timestamps were damning. Tom clocked in at 2:47 a.m., Hal 2:52 a.m. Both logging equipment usage, a city loader specifically, at 3:15 a.m. Exactly when Hal had confessed they dumped Gary's body. The paper trail Tom's expensive lawyer said didn't exist. It existed, hidden, deleted, but not destroyed. The FBI built their case like a cathedral, solid, undeniable, beautiful in its completeness. Wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and finally, murder. Tom Kincaid was arrested on November 3rd, 2022. This time, there was no expensive lawyer, no confident denials. He looked small in that interview room, shrunken by 18 years of running. "I didn't want to kill him," Tom finally said. "Gary was my friend, but he wouldn't listen. He was going to destroy everything, the money, the system. It had been working for years. Nobody was getting hurt. Except Gary and Linda." Tom's face crumbled. "We panicked. Hal said Gary slipped, hit his head. By the time I got there, he was already gone. We thought if we made it look like he just vanished, maybe they'd think he ran away. But then the investigation focused on Linda, and it was just easier. We made a few calls, pointed them her direction, let them build their case. The anonymous tip about her SUV. That was me. I saw her drive past the depot that night. She was probably looking for Gary, worried about the storm. Pure coincidence. But it gave us something to use. And you let an innocent woman go to prison." Tom said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The trial was swift. Both Tom and Hal were convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. The judge showed no mercy. Life without parole for both men. The courtroom didn't applaud this time. People just sat in stunned silence as two men in their 60s were led away in chains. Linda Linwood walked out of Highland Mountain Correctional Center on December 15, 2022. She was 59 years old. Marcus was now 46, Ethan 43. Both men stood waiting for their mother, gray threading through their hair, lives lived without her. She'd lost 18 years. Lost watching her boys grow up, graduate, get married. Lost grandchildren she'd never held as babies. Lost a husband she'd never properly grieved. The state offered compensation, apologies. None of it mattered. You can't buy back time. Eli interviewed Linda one final time in the small apartment she'd rented in Eagle River. She looked fragile, but unbroken, like winter birch that bends but doesn't snap. "What do you want people to know?" Eli asked. Linda was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at snow falling soft and clean. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Everyone said the snow hides everything, that it covers sins and secrets. That's what they counted on, Tom and Hal and everyone who stayed silent." She turned to face him. "But it doesn't. It preserves. It remembers. Eventually spring comes. Eventually everything frozen comes back to light." She smiled then, sad but genuine. Gary knew that. That's why he kept that logbook. That's why he wrote Proof. He knew eventually the truth would thaw. The podcast ended with the sound of wind through empty streets, and Eli's final words. This is frozen truth. Thank you for listening. And thank you, Gary, for refusing to let the snow win. In Anchorage, snow was falling again. It always did, but this time, people looked at it differently. Not as a shroud, but as a witness. Something that remembers everything. Hit subscribe if you believe everyone should be treated fairly. Only haters, manipulators, and trolls won't subscribe. If you believe people should be treated fairly, hit subscribe. Trolls won't. Comment, I stand for justice, if you're not siding with the bully.